welcome everybody. I'm RuthEllen Klinger-Bowne. As Louisa mentioned, I am with the University of Hawaii. My forte is really fish health management and diseases that affect fish. So I know we've been talking a lot about food safety, which predominantly focuses on reducing the risks with the plant portion, but with aquaponics and the fish playing such an integral part of the aquaponic system, we wanted to touch or focus some of the how we can assess and reduce those risks with the fish portion of aquaponics. Those that have been taking care of fish in an aquaculture setting, a lot of it might be kind of redundant or things you already know. So bear with me, but we're going to talk about how what the risks are, how you can mitigate those risks with the fish. So as you know, there's a lot of different systems with aquaponics. You can have small, you can have very large commercial systems. They may be indoor systems, they may be outdoor systems. But fortunately, they are relatively can have the same management strategies for taking care of that fish portion. Now, when I say about aquatic animal health management, we're looking at practices that are designed to prevent the disease from even occurring. You want to prevent the disease rather than having to treat the disease because it becomes very difficult in an aquaponic system. So biosecurity protocols, and this is something that that Lynn and Louisa touched upon with the plant portion. We can also introduce this with the fish as well. And there's really three principles with a biosecurity protocol. First, you want to prevent the introduction from even coming into your facility. If it does come in the facility, principle 2 is you don't want to spread it from your system to system. And thirdly, you want to have practices or management practices to reduce susceptibility of pathogens from coming in. That is, how do you reduce those stressors? So let's look at each of these principles separately. This has been mentioned before on the other 3-4 speakers. How do you prevent the introduction? Just like you did with how do you prevent it for plants, you're going to do this how you prevent it from having your fish getting sick. And there's anything and anyone can add a transfer of pathogen. And pathogen is anything that can cause a disease. And this is called a vector. And the vectors can be anything from bringing in new fish, new eggs. We talked about domestic animals such as chickens, dogs, cats, and feral animals as rats and slugs. But yes, your water source, as Kai mentioned, surface waters can be contaminated depending on your water source. And you may have live feeds. Where you get the live feeds could be an avenue of disease. And a lot of people don't think about it, but vehicles, things that come onto your property, as well as your visitors, can also become a vector for a disease. So how do you prevent the introduction with these vectors? Well, all new fish stocks, you want to get from a reputable dealer if you're bringing it from the outside, and of course quarantine. We'll talk about quarantine a little bit later. Same with the fish eggs, get it from a reputable dealer. And actually for both new fish stocks and fish eggs, oftentimes you can ask for health documentation. With live feeds, again, know your source, or even better, culture it yourself. Try to keep your domestic animals away from your aquaponic systems at all costs. And this is kind of difficult, especially with feral animals. You have to have some fencing, bird netting, maybe some sounds, maybe silver streamers to prevent the birds from coming into your system. People ask those visitors to wash their hands prior and after. Maybe have some disinfectant foot baths before they enter your facility. Ask the vehicles to park outside your facility. And of course, the water source. We talked a little bit about using ultraviolet radiation or chlorination. Just remember, if you do use chlorination on your water source previously to coming into your fish tank, you will have to dechlorinate. So covering the fish tank is actually not only prevents pests from getting into the fish tank, but it also prevents algae buildup, which can compete with your production of your plants, the things that you want to grow. This is a snail tape, a copper tape that prevents snails from climbing up to the grow beds, and fencing. Second principle is, how do you prevent the spread? Let's say you had a fish tank in one of your systems getting sick. Well, you want to try to dedicate equipment, nets, air stones, air lines to individual tanks if you can. If you can't, then you need to have some sort of disinfectant protocol where you will have your nets or other equipment. If you are able to dedicate one employee to just taking care of that contaminated system, or at least wait till the end of the day or treat that system last. Now, a little bit of word about disinfecting. There's a lot of factors that affect how well the disinfectant is going to work on your equipment, and it really depends on the type of disinfectant. A lot of people like to use bleach at 200 parts per million, and that's typically used as a dip, because if you leave it in, it will actually rip up the nets. So if you do use bleach, it's only a dip, and you have to rinse the equipment very well before you put it into the fish tank again. Concentration of the disinfectant is very important. Some disinfectants have a specific temperature or pH that is most efficient. How long the contact time is for the net to the pathogen. If you haven't changed your dipping bucket or trash can, there could be organic matter that builds up, and that will interfere with how effective that disinfectant is. If you have a lot of pathogens, the density could affect it. And a lot of, especially parasites, you can only get rid of the parasite in its free living stage. So the type and growth phase of the pathogen is very important. So, like I said, some disinfectants work better in certain situations than others, depending on what pathogen you have. But whatever you choose to use, follow the disinfectants label as well as the USDA guidelines. Now, whether your aquaponic system is outside or inside, the area surrounding it should be completely free of debris. Shouldn't have any unnecessary equipment. Keep the area clean. If it's outside, keep the grass low. Remove the leaves so you prevent pests from coming in. Inside, keep the area clean around. Have no unwanted equipment. And this, obstructions. And this is not only for the safety of pests or pathogens getting in, but also for the safety of your workers. Have all the replacement parts or disinfecting of nets and equipment in a separate area. And as mentioned in the previous talks, you want to have a separate eating area for your workers and a washroom available. And one other thing is, growing plants from seeds in your facility is a far better way than getting your seedlings from an outside source. And this will prevent any pests or pathogens potentially entering your facility. Okay, third principle. How do you reduce susceptibility? You eliminate the stressors. What I mean, you want to have good husbandry skills. This means good nutrition for your fish, avoiding overcrowding, have good water quality, good sanitation, and remove those dying and dead fish as soon as you see them. Now, transportation of fish, moving the fish from tank to tank or hauling fish outside the farm is probably one of the most stressful circumstances. So there's a few things that you can mitigate to take care of so the fish are not as stressed when you are handling them. First of all, you should have at least 24 hours before you feed, prior to transporting the fish. Do not feed them. if you're moving it from tank to tank inside your farm, have those water chemistries, know those water chemistries between the two systems very similar. If you're hauling it with buckets, don't overpopulate. If you're hauling fish or you're getting fish from outside, make sure your stocking density is low. This prevents any kind of spine damage, fin damage, bruising of fish. If they're overcrowded, they'll get very stressed out. Make sure there's a battery-operated aerator on board as well. Some fish species also benefit from a low-dose anesthesia or even a salt concentration from 0.5 to 1%. But that's to help with their osmoregulation. But this is very dependent on species. Once you get new fish or you move them, make sure they are in a separate tank or system far removed from your established systems. You have dedicated equipment, nets, pumps, airlines for each quarantine system that you have set up. When fish arrive, you want to have the temperature acclimated by putting the fish bag into the quarantine tank water. And the temperature and the pH is a critical parameter at this point. So here's a picture of acquiring fish. We have them in the quarantine tank in bags. We leave them in there for, depending on what the temperature, acclimate to whatever is in the tank water. And you can measure pH, dissolved water from both, and you can gradually add water from the tank into the bag. The important thing is, once the water chemistries are the same, you remove the fish with a net. You never put the bag water into the tank water because you don't know what has been in there. It could be, a lot of people will send with drugs or chemicals. How long do you keep them in quarantine? The rule of thumb is generally 30 days, and that really gives most pathogens out there affecting the fish. It's going to happen within those 30 days. It might behoove you to also get a fish health specialist or an aquatic veterinarian to look at the fish during that time. It's important to have you or your workers observe those in quarantine every day, and we'll do water chemistries so you can see when the onset of a disease, if it should occur, and take care and mitigate it right away. Now, Kai touched on this on the water source a little bit, and he did say that city water is, yes, the best source. If you use city water, you have to be aware that chlorine or chloramines are often treated in the municipal water, and so it will have to be dechlorinated, or the chloramines will have to be removed, because at very low levels, fish are affected and can die. Now, in like I said, the recirculating system, this is a coupled system. We talk about replenishment of water rather than topping off due to evaporation. You want to replenish the water, and this will maintain stable water conditions. If you're in the Florida area or some of the other Midwestern states, deep wells are often used for a water source. If it's very deep, you have to be aware of supersaturation of either nitrogen or oxygen, which will need to be degassed before adding to your system to prevent what we call gas bubble disease in our fish. Again, surface water such as natural streams, many pathogens can be in the streams. And if you are using a natural bottle of water, you should use some sort of ultraviolet or filtration system prior to adding it to the fish pond. Here in Hawaii, sometimes we use what we call rain catchment. If you are using rain catchment, be sure the water chemistries are similar to what you have in the aquaponic tank already. And be aware that some areas, rain can be very acidic with a low pH. So it's good to run the rain catchment water, again, through a filtration system to eliminate any kind of opportunistic pathogens. So what are some of the water chemistries? What should you be taking? This is all going to, if you know these water chemistries, you'll go a long way to preventing any kind of stress to your fish. Over 90% of the diagnostic cases I get are due to poor water quality. So if you take these water chemistry measurements seriously and record them, you can go a long way to relieving any kind of stress that might involve the fish. So temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, you want to measure daily. At least 2 times a week, measure your ammonia, your nitrites, and your nitrates. And there's a myriad of kits and meters out there, and it can be overwhelming. But generally, meters are more expensive, but they're quite accurate. Aquaponic or aquarium kits can be very useful as well, and they're usually fairly cheap. And it really depends on how many systems you have and how accurate you want to be and how much money you want to spend. So let's look at each of these parameters very quickly. Temperature is actually a major stressor to fish. And it's not the temperature itself, but it's the sudden change from warm to cold, cold to warm. So you want to know what the ideal temperature for the growth and reproduction of your specific fish species, or even an aquatic animal if you're not even doing fish. Along with that, you should realize what are the seasonal changes and how can that affect how they're eating, when they reproduce, and some diseases are more prevalent during certain temperatures, certain times of the year. Dissolved oxygen. This is not only important for our fish, but it's also important for the roots of our plants and also the bacteria that drive this whole system. For fish, we want at least 6 parts per million or 80% oxygen saturation. Most of the time, the oxygen is dispersed into an aquaponic system in the coupled system by the incoming water from the plant beds. So just be aware that if you just have the water coming in to provide the oxygen, that the higher the temperature or the more fish you have in there, a higher stocking density, that demand for oxygen is going to go up. And so you might have to consider getting an additional aeration in your fish tank to maintain that 6 parts per million. pH, or the potential of hydrogen. Very simply, it's a logarithmic scale from 1 to 14. Freshwater is 7, which is neutral. Anything below 7 is considered more acid, and above 7 is considered more basic. And just by the nitrogen cycling in our systems, in our aquaponic system, over time they create a decrease in pH over time. Plant growth for aquaponics is usually standard between 5.5 and 6.5. Therefore, you need to pick a fish species that can withstand that pH range. Just know that during the nitrification process, for each molecule of ammonia or nitrite, there's going to be 90 molecules of hydrogen that is produced, which means it's more hydrogen, means more acidic. So over time, pH is going to go down, and it can drop dramatically. That will affect the fish health. You'll be able to see if it is deteriorating. The fish health they'll be lethargic, they will stop eating, you might have frayed fins, you might see mucus or whitening on their scales. Fortunately, there is a remedy that's very simple, and it's just adding a calcium carbonate source. And what it does is it binds with the hydrogen ions, and you have a buffer type system, such as crushed coral, oyster shells. Some people even use eggshells, although be aware eggshells dissipate quite rapidly, and you have to add that more often. So the carbonate will help with the hydrogen, or bind with the hydrogen ions, and you'll have your pH gradually increase. And the rule of thumb is 1 to 2 pounds per 100 gallons. Okay, so as I said, the nitrogen cycle. Aquaponics is an ideal way of showing how the nitrification works. You're basically feeding the fish to feed the plants. When you feed the fish with fish food, that protein source becomes ammonia, which is then converted to nitrites and then converted to nitrates, which is actually what the plants are taking up. Be aware that for fish, ammonia and nitrites in very high levels will affect fish health. If you're having high levels of ammonia or nitrites, especially in an established aquaponic system, it's important to know that then you know that the nitrogen cycle is just not working properly. So for the health of the fish, the plants, and the bacteria that drive this whole cycle, it's important to test all three of these parameters at least 2 times a week. Now, most aquaponic farmers use commercial diets, and these diets have been specifically formulated for a specific fish species and maybe even a life stage. Some aquaponics farmers would like to sell their fish or use the fish as secondary income, which is fine, and they will go for typically a higher protein diet. This is also more expensive, so if you're more concerned of your fish just being a means to the end, your whole goal is to raise crops, then going to a lesser expense or cheaper feed that has a lower protein, as long as it fits the nutritional needs of the fish, it's okay to use. Just be aware that you need to have the pellet size the same size of the mouth size of the fish so they don't expend too much energy. Know that younger fish probably need to be fed more frequently than older fish, and there's charts out there that tell you how much you need to feed, when you need to feed, and know that percentage, but at the same time, we like to say feed to satiation. Do not say, okay, they have to be fed 3% today, so I'm going to throw in 3% of feed in the fish tank, because that could cause food wastage, poor water quality, and then, of course, cost to you that you just don't need to have. So we say feed to satiation. Just put a little food in there. Watch them eat. If they're eating ravenously, you can add more and more. Just be aware of costs of overfeeding. With a lot of different systems, some people have gone to automatic feeders, which means that the feed is distributed throughout the day within a 24-hour period. And that's fine, especially if you have a lot of systems that you have to deal with. Just be aware that each of these belt feeders or automatic feeders need to be cleaned daily to avoid mold or pests from getting in. Hand feeding is kind of an advantage point because you can watch the animals actually aggressively feeding or look for any behavioral change or looking for individuals that are not eating, that sort of thing. So I mentioned about feed storage, and again, like you said, you want to store it if you can at a cool, dry area. They want it in less than 70 degrees Fahrenheit and less than 50% relative humidity. Metal containers are really good for keeping out feral animals such as rats and mice, and elevating, keeping it out from other pests, insects. Try to limit how long you keep your food stored and follow the guidelines. Most of the fish food have expiration dates. I want to mention chemicals just briefly. Just use USDA approved chemicals. If you do have to, especially with the disinfectants, make sure it's far away from your aquaponic system. And any times after disinfectant, fully rinse those nets and equipment that were in the disinfectant before you immerse it into the fish tank. And just generally treatments, there's not a whole lot of approved drugs for food fish. You can use Google this approved drugs for U.S. and aquaculture, and there is a PDF by the Fish and Wildlife Service that tells you what drugs you can use. But we have the added caveat in aquaponics in that whatever you do to treat the fish, it's going to affect could affect the plants. There's not a lot of studies out there, but right now we just don't want to have uptake through the roots for the edible plants. It could be harmful to the plant itself and what it does to the human consumption. And even if you take the fish tank offline from the plant bed and treat the fish until they're better. Once you put it back online, now you still could have the pathogen that's in the plant bed reinfecting. So our whole thought is, let's not treat to begin with. Let's prevent any kind of pathogen entering my system so I don't have to treat. Now, briefly going to go over what pathogens can affect your fish. Most of these are not zoonotic. Those that affect humans. The ones I have in asterisk do are zoonotic, and I'll go through those in the next slide. So a pathogen can be a parasite, it can be a bacteria, it can be fungus, it can even be viruses. Parasitic infections, typically you see they'll be rubbing, they'll be irritated. Bacteria infections, they might be bloated, they'll have maybe perhaps pop-eye, not eating very well. Funguses are generally a secondary or tertiary problem to something like poor water quality. And the newest one is the tilapia lake virus that's occurring worldwide, that's affecting the tilapia. And viruses are very difficult to detect without professional diagnostic capabilities. Like I said, so we're interested in what are the fish diseases that can cause be a zoonotic and infect humans. And there's several bacteria that is actually ubiquitous in the environment, in the water, in the soil. But generally they are not, in fact, they don't affect humans unless they're immunocompromised or maybe in the elderly. In Hawaii, there is one parasite that has been a concern, Angiostrongylus cantonensis, which is the rat lungworm, and that is transferred through rats or slugs or snails and can affect the plants. This is not a parasite of fish, but in aquaponics, it can get on your leafy greens, your vegetables, and needs to be taken care of or washed thoroughly. So the bottom line is you need to train your workers or know what the potential hazards are, especially what zoonotic diseases are out there, what can be transmitted between the fish and your workers. A lot of injuries, it's more of a injury through spines, especially during handling. If you're calling them for euthanasia, such as decapitation, for marketing, knowing the sharp objects, know the chemical exposure, such as the disinfectants. Train your workers on the protocols, the proper protective gear. And there has been kind of mixed results with using UV sterilization or filtration to alleviate some of the zoonotic pathogens. It's really dependent on the levels of UV as well as the flow rate. E. coli and Salmonella are not considered pathogens in fish, but of course this is what we were all concerned about. And Kai mentioned about the study that they did a few years ago on what E. coli and finding actually very low levels of E. coli and no Salmonella levels in the aquaponic systems. But again, these are not pathogens of fish. So if you observe your fish daily, you can assess the health and the well-being. And the best time to observe them is actually during feeding. And that you can see if they're feeding aggressively. Do they appear sluggish or frightened upon your approach? That's all behavioral signs. And you can note any individuals that appear isolated from the rest of the population. You can see signs of any lesions, any growths, raggedy fins, and the timely records of anything out of the ordinary will assure the prompt response by you and your workers. And of course, writing it down. Train those workers on the standard operating procedures. How do you take the water chemistries? When do you take the water chemistries? How often? Feeding. What do you feed? How often do you feed? How do you store? Are you going to change the water? Are you making any system changes? All that should be written down. That way, should a problem arise, those good records will point to why to think if something went awry at the earliest stage possible. Some people will have a logbook where visitors can sign in. And this is just a precaution not only for the farmer, but also the visitor should problems arise. So what happens if your aeration pump fails and you have a drastic loss in oxygen? Does your workers, or do you know what to do or who to call? Have contingency plans in place for those things such as power outages, fish dying, or they're not eating, they're not behaving abnormally. This contingency planning will actually reduce that anxiety and reduce time and money spent on wasted or even inappropriate behaviors or activities. It will reduce the production loss and perhaps even lost markets. So basically, it's money. The contingency planning will reduce the strain economically for you and your farm.